our last topic that we're going to discuss here today are the biogeochemical cycles, or the inputs or outputs in our ecosystems. And the biogeochemical cycles are provide two functions in our ecosystems. And again, when you look at biogeochemical cycles, it sounds very complicated, but you break it down, and basically we see bio as living things, geo is the earth, and our chemistry. All of those things together, they cycle through all these different parts of our environment, all these materials. So when we think about these cycles, again, we think about recycled matter, it's really important because in our ecosystems, when we discuss sustainability, our ecosystems are sustainable naturally. These cycles prevent the accumulation of waste. So when organisms die or when they produce waste, ecosystems are designed to have organisms that can clean up that waste and again recycle those nutrients back into the system so other organisms can use that. So it prevents that accumulation of waste, and it also prevents the depletion of essential elements and nutrients. Okay, they're not used up. They're just they're used, they're changed, and they're replenished back into the system. So these cycles are really important. We are going to discuss 3 different cycles in here that apply to our conversation, and that's going to be the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. The first one we're going to discuss is the carbon cycle. And we know carbon as, from our periodic table. We know it's the element of organic chemistry and of life. And carbon comes in a lot of different molecules, okay, a lot of different compounds. For example, we have elemental carbon, or carbon C. We also have carbon dioxide. We're familiar with this, CO2, that we exhale from our bodies, plants take in during photosynthesis. And also something called bicarbonate that we find in a lot of different places, but we think of it in our hydrosphere and our water. Bicarbonate, it makes bodies of water generally a little bit basic. Okay, we'll talk about that. A little bit more basic, meaning a little bit above 7 on our pH scale. Also contained in our bodies, we have bicarbonate that neutralizes stomach acid as our acids leave our stomach. So this is naturally occurring in our environment. And again, carbon is in a lot of different things. We talked about it being in glucose, etc., around all living things. So it's important that we talk about the carbon cycle for multiple reasons. We have, I have an image here of, a very general carbon cycle, and you'll see how we know in photosynthesis we have carbon dioxide absorbed by plants and converted into glucose, like we said before, or we have organic carbon, again the carbon that's in living things. When those organisms die and decay, whether it's the plants or the animals, we have organisms that are there to decompose that matter. And that decomposed matter can, again, be converted into what we call fossils, and therefore into our fossil fuels. Okay, remember that fossils are really long dead organisms, way long time, years and years and years under pressure and heat, and we have these fossils that form, and we can pull them out of the earth, light them on fire, and use them as these fossil fuels. So that's all organic matter. Remember, when we talk about fossilized matter, it's all going to contain carbon because it was once living, all right, and it's dead now. Okay, that's different than non-living. Sometimes we think non-living is dead, but try not to confuse that. All dead matter contains carbon because it was once living. When we talk about non-living things like water, precipitation, humidity, abiotic factors, those were never living, they're not dead, they are completely non-living. All right, we know that during respiration, okay, when we exhale, we release carbon dioxide. During cell respiration, that goes back up into the atmosphere, root respiration, etc. We have oceans taking in carbon dioxide. We will talk about that later in the semester, what's going on there. And we see this natural cycle. What's not natural about this cycle is what you see off to the right of our screen, where you see the factory releasing carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. So when we think about the carbon cycle, carbon naturally exists, carbon dioxide naturally exists in our cycle. The concern is that we have a natural cycle that we are offsetting, and all three of these cycles that we talk about today are being offset by things that we're doing. Okay, it doesn't mean that we're creating new matter, of course, because matter is conserved. What it means is that we are changing the places that these things are found in our environment. Okay, that's the big difference. So when you see the fossil fuels at the bottom, we clearly know we extract fossil fuels in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas. We light them in fire, and that releases carbon up into the atmosphere. And when we do that a lot, there's a lot more carbon up into the atmosphere than is stored in the ground, where, you know, it would stay for many, many, many years if we didn't extract it. So it's kind of offsetting that balance, and that's when we get concerned. So what I want to do is talk for a minute about, you know, what is our impact on this cycle. Okay, the impact that we're having on that carbon cycle is like we saw in our image there, that we are, again, extracting fossil fuels at an extremely high rate. We're removing them from the earth, where, again, they would remain for many, many years, and we are burning them. So we're lighting them on fire, and that releases carbon gases. Okay, that's a lot of gas going up into the atmosphere that wouldn't normally be there. So what's our impact? Well, one, we're burning fossil fuels. So that's increasing the CO2 up in the atmosphere. Okay, in addition, we are deforesting areas at a higher rate than those plants are being replanted. So here, you know, in the United States, we have a lot of sustainable forests, so we don't really do that. But in other parts of the world, that is not the case. Trees are coming down at a much higher rate than planting is going on. So that has kind of a twofold effect, where not only are we having the whole deforestation concern, excuse me, but that means that there's not that sink there for carbon to be reabsorbed at the surface of the earth. So we're putting a lot more carbon up, and we're removing the ability of the earth to reabsorb it, the plants. Okay, I said earlier that the oceans do absorb some carbon, or I should say a lot of carbon, and we thought, well, maybe that's a good thing, but it turns out it's really not a good thing. It has negative impacts on the oceans by making them more acidic. So when we think about this, the impacts that we're having, we're burning a lot of fossil fuels, and we're taking out plants that would be able to absorb that carbon dioxide. So it's just really increasing how much carbon dioxide is up in our atmosphere. Okay, so what does that mean? Why do we care about that? We care about that because carbon dioxide is one of our major greenhouse gases. That means it traps heat at Earth's surface. And the more we have up there, the more heat gets trapped and the warmer our Earth becomes. And that's just the way it is. It's a naturally occurring greenhouse gas. But the concern is that it's there in such excess amounts that it's trapping way more heat than ever at Earth's surface. And it's really increasing our Earth's global ocean temperatures, and that's driving our climates to change. So that is a big deal. Okay, that's our major concern about carbon. Okay, we will continue to talk about carbon as we get into talking about energy resources and fossil fuels, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in the semester when we talk about climate change. So next I want to talk about the phosphorus cycle. And the phosphorus cycle is again, it's one of our elements on our periodic table, and it is a plant nutrient. And we find phosphorus in different places, but we don't find it in the atmosphere. Phosphorus does not have a gas phase, Okay, so we find it in our hydrosphere, in living things, we find it in our lithosphere, but never in our atmosphere. It doesn't have a gas phase. So when we think about phosphorus, okay, phosphorus is a plant nutrient. It is very important for plant growth. When we look at fertilizer bags, for example, we see that they have 3 elements on them: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and NPK. And again, the 2 elements that we're going to talk about the rest of today are phosphorus and nitrogen. So those are 2 of them. They are both plant nutrients, essential for plant growth. And so we think they're a very positive thing when they're used naturally or properly. So when we think about pros and cons, again, positives are that it is a natural element in the environment. For plants, again, it's a really important plant nutrient. It can be a limiting factor if it's not present for plants. And the concern is that when we think about phosphorus, if it's in too high amounts, it can cause too much growth, and that can be a negative, and we'll talk about that. All right, when we look at the phosphorus cycle, an image, or simplified image of one, we'll see that, again, it doesn't exist in the air, in the atmosphere. It exists in plant bodies, in the earth, in water. So we'll see that, again, it's absorbed by plants. That can, again, if it's cropland, we can harvest those plants, feed them to humans or animals, and again, if it's released in our waste products, that's going to end up in the environment. Organisms can, biodegrade that or decompose it, and it comes back into the earth, and it's recycled up and back into plants. So we see this nice kind of circling going on in our diagram. A concern there, really, with the phosphorus cycles on the on the right side of the diagram, where we're applying more phosphorus. So when we think about fertilizers, we might be applying too much, and the plants don't need that much, so they're going to absorb what they need. They're going to use it, and anything left over on the ground, we run the risk of eroding or running off. So you'll see there on the right that we have erosion and runoff. And when we have erosion and runoff, we're taking soil with everything in it with it, or the water is running off and picking up those nutrients, and off it goes, typically into some body of water. That's where we get concerned, that erosion and runoff. So thinking about what our impact is it comes from a couple different places. In our diagram, you saw erosion and runoff as a concern. When phosphorus runs off, it causes issues in other places. Okay, so how do we put it in there? One way is fertilizer, but another way is also that we have phosphorus or phosphates in some of our detergents. So when we use detergents in our homes, for example, if they contain phosphates, those phosphates come out of our homes and either go into our septic systems, or they go off to our sewage treatment facilities. And a lot of sewage treatment facilities can't handle removing phosphorus before the water is discharged into the environment. So a lot of this phosphorus is getting out into our waterways via detergents, via fertilizers, and it's going to places where it wasn't intended in the first place. Another way is by deforesting, similar to the carbon cycle. If we take plants off of the ground, if we take trees away, that soil becomes very vulnerable to erosion. The phosphorus that exists there isn't going to be absorbed by plants, and instead it's going to be washed off into a waterway with the soil. Okay, we see a lot of erosion when we remove trees from sites. So there's a lot of ways that this phosphorus gets out into the water. Why is that a bad thing? It's a bad thing because it's a plant nutrient. Okay, where it's meant to be is great, but where it's not meant to be in our waterways, it can cause excessive plant growth. when we discuss this a little bit later, we'll talk about a process called eutrophication in water pollution. And what that is when we see these excess nutrients getting into our waterways, it makes plants grow excessively. It can make plankton grow excessively and reproduce. And what that does is we end up often seeing excess plant growth at the water surface. When plants cover the water surface of a pond, for example, light can no longer penetrate that water column, and when that happens, all the submerged aquatic vegetation can't get light. And we know when vegetation or plants can't get light, they can't photosynthesize and they die. When those organisms die and float to the bottom of the water, they're decomposed, okay, like a natural cycle. They're going to be decomposed. And the concern is that when there's excess decomposition going on there, what happens is these organisms down there are what we call aerobically respiring organisms. That means that they use oxygen, as do we, to respire. Okay, they use oxygen to break down glucose and make energy from their food. And all this waste plant material, all this dead plant matter, is their food. So they take in their food, they take in the oxygen, they respire it, and they survive, and they grow. And the decomposers are having a field day because they have all the food they need. And they start taking more and more oxygen out of the water, and they divide, and they grow, and they divide, and they have all this food, and that is just making them so happy. But what it does to the water column is it really decreases the amount of oxygen that's there. And as we talked about before, oxygen can be a limiting factor for organisms. So when that oxygen level creeps down and down and down and down, all of a sudden we'll see a body of water becoming what we call hypoxic, or you might have heard of dead zones before, where species can't live, where fish die. And that is really the huge concern with having excess nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen in our waterways. They don't belong there in those levels. They cause excess growth to occur. When they die and decompose, excess decomposition takes place. And that decomposition process uses a lot of oxygen. And it just drops that DO, or that dissolved oxygen, in the water, and a lot of our organisms die. All right, the last cycle that I'm going to discuss today is the nitrogen cycle. And it has a lot of similarities to the phosphorus cycle, because remember, they're both plant nutrients. When we think about nitrogen, there is a gas phase, nitrogen gas, or N2. It makes up about 78% of atmospheric gas. It's a large proportion of it. And a lot of that doesn't ever come down to the earth because there's only some bacteria that are able to pull it out of the air. They're called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and it's called nitrogen fixation. And there's only some bacteria that are able to do that. So a lot of it just stays up there in the atmosphere. It's natural, no issue up there with it. Nitrogen can also appear as so many different forms. Ammonium ions, I'm sure you've heard of ammonia, nitrate, nitrite. Okay, different forms, different nitrogen compounds that exist in nature, not only in the atmosphere, but in bodies of organism, organic nitrogen, as well as in our lithosphere, our hydrosphere, etc. When we look at our impact, let's look at first at our diagram. So looking at our diagram, we can see that there's a lot going on. The nitrogen cycle is pretty complicated. We see, obviously we have our gaseous form. On here I don't see our nitrogen fixers, but there are nitrogen fixing bacteria. You can see it at the bottom on the right there. There is some fixation of nitrogen from the atmosphere to the earth. We see plants consuming nitrogen. Obviously it's a big plant nutrient. We have, animals eating plants, and again, that recycling back, recycling into organic matter, plants and animals, and then back into the earth. We see that ammonium, the nitrates that I mentioned, all these bacteria that can just keep converting this nitrogen into different forms, into ammonia, into nitrates. And then there are some denitrifying bacteria, you'll see over there on the left, that they can take nitrates and convert it into nitrogen gas. So those are called denitrifiers, or denitrifying bacteria, or the process is called denitrification. So we see this cycling of nitrogen naturally in the environment, and it's good into all its different forms. It's highly complicated. But our concern here is, how do we impact this system? Okay, our impact on the nitrogen cycle is a couple different things. Similar to the phosphorus cycle, we apply a lot of nitrogen through synthetic fertilizers or organic fertilizers. We get nitrogen into our soil that wouldn't typically be there, and under normal circumstances that is fine. When we apply it in excess, it causes all those problems that we talked about in terms of phosphorus as well. Okay, we have what I said, there are some nitrogen-fixing bacteria that take in nitrogen from the atmosphere. Well, we have certain crops like legumes that do that as well. They pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and they put it into the soil. If we have deforestation, similar thing to the phosphorus cycle, we leave that soil vulnerable to erosion and runoff of nutrients. So all of those ways we can get nitrogen into our waterways where it's really unintended. The impact of that, there's all the same kind of things that we talked about before. Heavy fertilization, having too much nitrogen in our soil, exposing it during deforestation can lead to excess nitrogen in our waterways. When that nitrogen gets there, just like the phosphorus, it can cause too much growth of plankton or vegetation at the top of the water column. The water column becomes shaded, photosynthesis can't take place, plants die, they become decomposed, and all of that decomposition, that excess decomposition, leads to hypoxic zones or dead zones in the waterways. So again, phosphorus and nitrogen, very similar because they are both plant nutrients. They're great in the right place, very harmful in the wrong place. So we have to be really careful about what we're applying and how much. And that's involved in, educating certainly farmers and people in agriculture about how to properly do that so that we don't have excess amounts in our waterways. In addition, certainly our lawns, residents, businesses apply these types of fertilizers to our environments for the same thing, for our grass growing, staying green, etc. So doing it in the proper amount that the grass or the plants can use is really, really important. Okay, that's the end of our discussion here in terms of the biogeochemical cycles. Again, the reason I wanted to spend some time going through and reviewing some things and introducing some new things is because all of this will be very important as we're trying to figure out what impact we're having on our environment. We have to understand how the ecosystems work first, and now we can kind of move on a little bit into what the impact we're having on that environment. When we talk about the nitrogen and phosphorus pollutants, those nutrient pollutants that are getting into our waterways inadvertently from fertilizer runoff, from detergent runoff in terms of phosphorus, we know that that's affecting the Chesapeake Bay. It's affecting all different types of waterways, from the Chesapeake Bay to the Gulf of Mexico here in the United States, and other waterways around the world. And that whole idea of eutrophication and hypoxic zones, those resulting factors, we see that. the over-harvesting, as your textbook talks about, of the oyster populations there that filter those nutrients out. When they are absent, those nutrients build up there. They cause that overgrowth, that death and decomposition. That decomposition causes oxygen to become depleted in those waterways. And we see those dissolved oxygen levels that are so critical for species that live there. They need to be high. We see them declining to very low levels that can't support life in our open water. When we look at this image of the Chesapeake Bay, you can see to the right there, the dissolved oxygen levels in the different areas of the bay, and you see some of the watershed leading into the bay from Baltimore, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, Norfolk, and you can see those really super low levels of oxygen. Again, think about all that runoff from all of those lands leading into the bay there, and causing that, those hypoxic zones there from all those different things, whether it's the farms, the city runoff, industrial runoff, forests, leaving, taking trees away, letting nutrients just flow out from erosion and runoff, all contribute to that. And you can see that Chesapeake Bay watershed going, all the way up to New York State in that green region in the middle of your screen there, all the way up to New York State's up there through Pennsylvania. There's some of the big rivers like Susquehanna and the Potomac, all the way down Baltimore. You even see West Virginia over there. All of that leading into the bay. So everything that's going on in that area and that runs off and erodes heads down into that waterway out into the ocean. It can cause all kinds of issues there, and you can see those hypoxic zones, how, basically the result of that. This is a great image from your textbook showing that input of the nutrient pollution, the nitrogen and phosphorus input. You can see that nitrogen and phosphorus being in the water where it doesn't belong causes the phytoplankton, those photosynthetic plankton in the water, booming, okay, flourishing, because now they have those nutrients they need. They can photosynthesize more. They have everything that they need to do that. So their populations start to grow and grow and grow and grow. Okay, now that is unsustainable. They will run out of some kind of resource. They will create a mat. They will, have an issue where they're going to shade, for example, submerged aquatic vegetation. Those dead phytoplankton are going to fall to the bottom, and basically the bacteria that are down there, those decomposers, are going to then decompose the phytoplankton. When they do that, they aerobically respire, and therefore they use oxygen in that breakdown process, and they consume the more phytoplankton that's there. It feeds that microbe population. Those bacteria grow and grow and grow. They use more and more oxygen to complete that decomposition, and those oxygen levels start to creep down, creep down, creep down, creep down, creep down, and that causes those hypoxic zones, those dead zones, where we see organisms like oysters and grasses, fish and shrimp, you'll see there in number 5, dying because they just do not have the appropriate amount of oxygen necessary to sustain life. And you can see at the top of the water column there, the warm or less dense fresh water layer that is oxygenated. And then we see that denser, colder layer at the bottom that becomes hypoxic. And we will talk about later the fact that typically colder water holds more oxygen. So it should be really well oxygenated down there under normal circumstances. But since this whole eutrophication process or nutrient enrichment process is happening, it's causing those dead zones to form there. And we'll revisit this again a little bit later in the semester again when we talk about water pollutants.